December 14th, 1944, Sergeant Frank Griffin stood in the turret of his M36 tank destroyer, watching the tree line 300 yards ahead. His crew had been in Belgium for exactly 6 days. In that time, they'd seen more German armor than in their previous 3 months combined. The intelligence report sat folded in Griffin's pocket. He'd read it twice already that morning. Testing by 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion confirms M36 90mm gun cannot penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at any range with available ammunition. Recommend extreme caution when engaging heavy German tanks. Griffin's gunner, Corporal James Novak, had read it too. So had the loader, Private Eddie Walsh, and the driver, Specialist Tom Henderson. They all knew what it meant. The weapon they'd been trained on, the gun they'd been told would finally give them parity with German heavy armor, was officially inadequate. The M36 Jackson was supposed to be America's answer to the Panther and Tiger 90mm main gun, the most powerful armament on any American armored vehicle in Europe. It had arrived just 2 months earlier, in October 1944, with promises that it could engage any German tank on equal terms. Now, 6 weeks later, official testing said otherwise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem wasn't theoretical, it was mathematical, physical, undeniable. The Tiger II, which the Americans called the King Tiger, had frontal armor 7 inches thick, sloped at 40 degrees. The M36's standard M82 armor-piercing round could penetrate roughly 5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Against flat plate, it might punch through. Against the King Tiger's sloped glacis, the shell would ricochet every time. The Germans knew it. American tank destroyer crews knew it. And in mid-December 1944, German forces were massing for what would become the largest armored offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. Griffin had joined the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion in September, just as the M36 were being issued. Before that, he'd commanded an M10 Wolverine, armed with a 3-inch gun that struggled against even medium German tanks past 500 yards. The M36 was supposed to change everything. The 90mm M3 gun was adapted from an anti-aircraft weapon. It fired a 24-pound projectile at 2,800 feet per second. On paper, it matched the famous German 88mm gun used on the Tiger Y. The same calculations that made the 88 legendary should have made the 90mm equally feared. But the Germans had upgraded. The Tiger II mounted a longer, more powerful 88mm gun, the KWK-43. It could penetrate the M36's thin armor from 2,000 yards. The M36 couldn't reliably penetrate the Tiger II from any distance, not frontally. American tank destroyer doctrine had always emphasized mobility over armor. The idea was simple. Don't get hit. Use speed, use positioning, ambush the enemy, shoot first, displace before they can return fire. It worked against Panzer IVs and Stugs. It even worked against Panthers if you caught them from the side. Against King Tigers, the doctrine fell apart. The King Tiger weighed 70 tons. It had armor that made it nearly impervious from the front. Its gun could kill anything the Americans fielded from distances where American guns couldn't even see the target clearly. And while it was slow, it didn't need to be fast. It just needed to point its frontal armor toward the threat and wait. Griffin's battalion had received its first M36s in late October. The vehicles came with technical manuals, gunnery tables, and optimistic briefings about how the 90mm would finally let American tank destroyers engage German heavy armor effectively. The crews trained for 2 weeks, familiarizing themselves with the new turret layout, the electric traverse system, the slightly different recoil characteristics of the bigger gun. Then they went to the front and reality set in. On November 23rd, near Pfuffendorf, elements of the 702nd engaged a German defensive position that included 3 Tiger IIs. The German tanks were hull down, dug in, presenting only their thickest frontal armor. American tank destroyers opened fire from 1,500 yards. The 90mm shells hit, sparks flew, the shells ricocheted into the sky. The Tigers returned fire. 2 M36s were destroyed. 1 M4 Sherman was knocked out. The Americans withdrew. After-action reports noted that the 90mm gun had achieved multiple hits on Tiger II frontal armor with no penetrations. Crews reported that the German tanks seemed confident, almost contemptuous, maintaining their positions and methodically engaging American vehicles without attempting to maneuver for better angles. The psychological impact was immediate. Tank destroyer crews had spent the previous year learning to respect German armor. The Panther was deadly. The Tiger. I was terrifying, but they were killable, especially if you got them from the side or caught them moving. The King Tiger seemed unkillable. More engagements followed. Near Gerionsweiler on November 28th, outside Aldenhoven on December 2nd. Each time, M36s hit King Tigers frontally. Each time, the shells bounced off. Each time, American vehicles burned. The formal testing came in early December. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion fired repeated shots at a captured King Tiger hull from various ranges, 1,000 yards, 500 yards. Even at point-blank range, the standard M82 armor-piercing round could not reliably penetrate the frontal glacis. The report was classified, but word spread through the tank destroyer battalions in days. The gun everyone had been counting on didn't work. Not against the heaviest German armor. Not when it mattered most. Griffin remembered the conversation in his crew's bivouac the night after they'd gotten word about the testing. Walsh, the loader, had asked the obvious question. "So, what are we supposed to do if we run into a King Tiger?" Henderson, the driver, had an answer. "Run." Novak, the gunner, was more analytical. "The report said frontal armor, right? What about the sides? What about the turret?" "Good luck getting a side shot," Henderson said. "Those things don't move fast, but their doctrine is to keep the front toward the enemy, and the turret face is nearly as thick as the hull." "Then we're fucked." Griffin had let them talk. They needed to process it, needed to work through the fear. But privately, he was doing his own calculations. The M36 carried 47 rounds of 90mm ammunition. 11 rounds were stored in the turret bustle. 36 were in the hull sponsons. Standard combat load was 40 rounds of M82 armor-piercing and 7 rounds of M71 high-explosive for soft targets. If the armor-piercing rounds wouldn't work against King Tigers, maybe there were alternatives. The technical manual mentioned 2 experimental rounds. The T-16 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, used a tungsten carbide core and could theoretically penetrate 8.7 inches of armor at 500 yards. The T-33, a heat-treated steel shot with improved ballistics, was supposed to perform better against sloped armor than the standard M82. Neither round was in general distribution. The HVOP rounds required tungsten, which was in short supply. The T-33 was still experimental. A few rounds had been issued to some units for field testing, but most tank destroyer battalions had never seen them. Griffin had put in a request through his company commander. Captain Morrison had filed the paperwork up the chain. Days passed. No response. Meanwhile, German activity increased along the front. Reconnaissance flights reported armor concentrations in the Ardennes forest. Prisoners mentioned training for offensive operations. Allied intelligence assessed the reports and concluded the Germans were conducting defensive preparations, possibly shifting units to counter expected Allied advances. The assessment was wrong. On the morning of December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. 29 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions, attacked along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes. The offensive caught American forces completely by surprise. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion was positioned near St. Vith, a critical road junction in eastern Belgium. When the attack began, Griffin's company was 10 miles behind the front lines, supposedly in a rest area. Within hours, they were combat-loaded and moving toward the sound of guns. The weather was overcast, near freezing, with low clouds that grounded Allied air support. Perfect conditions for a German offensive. By evening of the first day, German spearheads had penetrated 15 miles in some sectors. American units were falling back, some in good order, others in confusion. Reports coming back from the forward areas mentioned heavy German armor, lots of Panthers, multiple Tigers, and King Tigers, definitely King Tigers. Griffin's platoon leader, Lieutenant Aaron Moss, briefed the crews at dusk. The situation is fluid. German armor is advancing on multiple axes towards St. Vith. Our mission is to establish blocking positions along the approaches and delay enemy armor as long as possible. Battalion has requested air support and artillery priority. Weather is expected to remain poor for at least 48 hours, so don't count on air. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. What about ammunition? Did we get any HVAP? Moss shook his head. Negative. Standard combat load only. The crews looked at each other. Standard ammunition meant M82 rounds that wouldn't penetrate King Tiger frontal armor. It meant engaging the most heavily armored tanks in the German arsenal with a weapon officially rated as inadequate. Sir, Griffin said, the testing report from 703rd said, I know what the report said, Sergeant. Battalion knows too, but we don't have a choice. The Germans are coming, and we're what's available. Doctrine still applies. Use terrain. Shoot from defilade. Aim for tracks and optics if you can't get penetrations. And if you see a King Tiger, don't engage it frontally unless absolutely necessary. Then what do we do? Moss met Griffin's eyes. Get creative. That night, Griffin's crew positioned their M36 along a wooded ridge overlooking a farm road 2 miles east of St. Vith. The position gave them good observation and decent cover. A small hill to their right would provide concealment if they needed to displace quickly. The road below ran relatively straight for about 1,500 yards before curving into a tree line. They dug in as best they could. The ground was frozen, which made entrenchment difficult, but they managed to create a shallow hold-down position that exposed only the turret. Henderson positioned the vehicle carefully, ensuring they had a reverse route behind the ridge. Novak zeroed the gun on reference points along the road. Walsh organized ammunition, placing armor-piercing rounds for easy access. Griffin established communication with the platoon net and, with the infantry company, dug in 500 yards to their left. And then they waited. The temperature dropped. Frost formed on the turret ring. The crew took turns on watch. 2 men up, 2 men trying to sleep in the cramped interior. Griffin stayed in the turret with Novak, watching the road through binoculars, listening to increasingly confused radio traffic. Reports came in fragments. German armor advancing near Schönberg. American positions overrun at 3 separate points. Friendly forces withdrawing from sectors. Unable to hold. Ammunition running low. Casualties heavy. And then, around 0300 hours on December 17th, a new report. Multiple King Tigers confirmed moving northwest on highway towards St. Vith. Estimate 5 to 7 vehicles. Infantry support. Unknown additional armor. Griffin felt his stomach tighten. Multiple King Tigers. His M36, with its supposedly inadequate gun, was sitting directly in their path. The King Tigers appeared at dawn. Griffin saw them through the morning mist, dark shapes moving slowly along the farm road. He counted 5 vehicles initially, then spotted a 6th bringing up the rear, massive, angular, unmistakable. Each one displaced 70 tons of steel and menace. Behind them came infantry, maybe a company's worth, staying close to the tanks for protection. 2 half-tracks followed at a distance, and further back, Griffin could make out what looked like Panzer IVs, medium tanks providing support for the heavies. His hand found the radio handset. White 2 to White 1, contact 6 King Tigers approaching from the east plus infantry and supporting armor, range 2,000 yards. Lieutenant Moss's voice came back tight with tension. White 1 copies, hold position. Do not engage until they're within effective range. Effective range. The phrase would have been funny if Griffin's mouth weren't so dry. According to the testing report, there was no effective range for the M36 against King Tiger frontal armor, not 2,000 yards, not 200. Novak was already tracking the lead vehicle through his sight. I can see the commander. He's standing in the cupola. Arrogant bastard. He's got reason to be, Walsh muttered from the loader's position. He knows we can't hurt him from the front. Griffin raised his binoculars again. The lead, King Tiger, was now 1,500 yards away, moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour. The German commander stood exposed in the turret, scanning the terrain ahead. The tank's gun pointed straight forward, a long barrel that looked almost too big for the turret. The Germans were advancing in a column formation, each tank about 50 yards behind the next. Standard road march. They weren't expecting contact, or, if they were, they didn't consider it a serious threat. Griffin's mind raced through the tactical problem. 6 King Tigers in column, frontal armor, impenetrable, side armor, vulnerable, but difficult to target. The lead tank would reach their position in roughly 5 minutes at current speed. If he engaged frontally and failed to penetrate, the Germans would identify his position immediately. Return fire would come within seconds. The King Tiger's gun could destroy the M36 with a single hit, but if he didn't engage, the column would pass within 400 yards of his position. They might spot him anyway, and they'd continue towards St. Vith, where American infantry were dug in, with weapons completely inadequate for stopping heavy armor. Range 1,300, Novak said quietly. The lead, King Tiger, kept coming. Griffin could see details now through his binoculars. The Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste coating the hull. The track links, each one as big as a man's torso. The commander's face under his headset, looking left toward a farm building. Range 1,200, Griffin made his decision. Henderson, when I give the word, you're going to reverse us hard behind the ridge. Novak, you're going to put 1 round into the side of the last tank in the column. Not the lead, the last one. Aim for the turret ring. Novak's voice rose. The last one. But Sergeant, the last one. The others will have to turn around to engage us. That's 30 seconds minimum with their turret traverse. We shoot, we displace, we relocate to alternate position. Questions? Walsh spoke up. What if we don't penetrate? Then we're no worse off than if we'd done nothing. Load armor piercing. Up! Griffin watched the column continue forward. The lead tank was now 900 yards away, too close for comfort. The last tank was 1,400 yards, just entering the straight section of road. He waited. Patience was agony. Every instinct screamed to fire now, to do something. But he needed the geometry to be right, needed the last tank to reach a point where its side armor was exposed, where the angle would be favorable, where a side shot might actually work. Range to rear target 1,100 yards, Novak said. He'd figured out Griffin's plan and adjusted his aim. I have a good angle on his left side. Wait. The column kept moving. 1,000 yards. The commander of the 3rd King Tiger was pointing at something to the right, speaking into his radio. The formation began to slow. They see something, Walsh said. They see the infantry positions, Griffin said. They're preparing to engage. Novak, you ready? Angle's good. Side armor exposed. Targeting turret ring. Griffin took a breath. This was the moment. 6 King Tigers, supposedly invulnerable, and he was about to find out if a 90mm gun really was as inadequate as the testing report claimed. Fire! The gun roared. The M36's entire frame shuddered with recoil. The muzzle blast created a massive cloud of white smoke that instantly obscured Griffin's view. His ears rang despite the padded headset. Hit! Novak shouted. Penetration. The turret. Go! Griffin yelled at Henderson. Reverse now! The M36's engine screamed. The tank destroyer lurched backward, tracks churning frozen ground. They shot behind the ridge just as the first German return fire arrived. An 88mm shell passed through the space where they'd been 3 seconds earlier, impacting a tree 200 yards behind them. Henderson didn't slow down. He kept reversing, following the route they'd planned, putting terrain between them and the German guns. More shells fell, bracketing their last position, but the Germans were shooting at where they'd been, not where they were. Alternate position, Griffin commanded. Henderson yanked the controls left, spun the M36 around a barn, and raced north along a farm track they'd reconnoitered the previous night. 600 yards later, he pulled into a prepared position behind a stone wall. The entire displacement had taken 90 seconds. Griffin grabbed his binoculars and scrambled to where he could observe the German column. What he saw made his breath catch. The last King Tiger was stopped, smoke pouring from its turret. The turret itself sat at an odd angle, clearly damaged. The crew was bailing out, tumbling from hatches and running away from the burning vehicle. "Jesus," Walsh breathed. "We killed a King Tiger." But that wasn't what held Griffin's attention. What amazed him was what the other 5 King Tigers were doing. They weren't advancing. They weren't charging forward to support the infantry. They'd stopped. All 5 of them had halted in place, their commanders buttoned up inside, their guns traversing frantically, searching for the source of the shot that had just destroyed one of their number. They were scared. Griffin keyed the radio. "White 2 to White 1. Rear target destroyed. Column has halted. They're looking for us." A pause. Then Moss's voice, disbelief clear even through the radio static. "Say again, White 2. You destroyed a King Tiger?" "Affirmative. Side shot to the turret ring." "Complete penetration." Another pause. Longer this time. Griffin imagined Moss processing the information, comparing it against the testing report, against everything they'd been told about the M36's inadequacy. "White 1, to all white elements. You heard White 2. The 90mm works if you get the angle right. All units prepare to engage from flanking positions. Repeat, flanking positions only. Do not engage frontally." Griffin smiled. It was a tight, hard smile, but genuine. The Germans had designed the King Tiger to be invulnerable from the front. They'd armored it so heavily that no Allied gun could penetrate its glacis. They'd trained their crews to always keep the front toward the enemy, to use that massive frontal armor as an impenetrable shield. But armor wasn't a shield if you didn't know which direction the threat was coming from. The German column was paralyzed. Their doctrine said, keep the front toward the enemy. But where was the enemy? The shot had come from their left, rear. But when they'd turned to engage that position, the attacker was gone. Was it still there? Had it moved? Were there more American tank destroyers hidden nearby? The German commander, probably in the lead tank, was facing an impossible problem. If he continued the advance, he'd expose his column's flanks to an enemy he couldn't see. If he turned the entire column to face the threat, he'd stall the offensive and expose different tanks' flanks to potential fire from other directions. If he spread out to cover multiple angles, he'd break formation and lose. Mutual support. The King Tiger's greatest advantage, its impenetrable frontal armor, had become its greatest vulnerability, because now it had to protect that armor from threats that might come from any direction. Griffin watched through his binoculars as the German column began a slow, awkward repositioning. The lead tank turned 90 degrees left, pointing its gun toward Griffin's last firing position. The second and third tanks moved to create a defensive perimeter. The fourth tank backed up, trying to protect the disabled vehicle's crew. They were no longer an assault force. They were a defensive position, static and vulnerable. "White 4 to White 1, came another voice on the radio. "Lieutenant Morrison's platoon, positioned a half-mile to the north. I have 3 targets at 1,600 yards. Permission to engage flanks. White 1 copies. Engage at will." Griffin didn't see Morrison's shot, but he heard the gun and saw the result. Another King Tiger shuddered to a halt, thick black smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out immediately. Now, the Germans were in real trouble. 2 King Tigers disabled. 4 operational. But those 4 were surrounded by terrain that could hide American tank destroyers, facing an enemy that had demonstrated it could kill them if it got the right angle. The German commander made his decision. The column withdrew. It wasn't a rout. The operational King Tigers backed up carefully, keeping their frontal armor toward the American positions, covering the disabled vehicle's crews as they retreated. But it was absolutely a withdrawal. 6 King Tigers had run into American M36s, lost 2 vehicles, and decided discretion was the better part of valor. Griffin watched them go, hardly believing what he was seeing. The King Tiger was supposed to be invincible. Testing had said the 90mm couldn't penetrate its armor. Every tactical briefing had emphasized avoiding engagement with German heavy tanks unless absolutely necessary. But two King Tigers were burning on a farm road in Belgium because crews using inadequate guns had figured out that armor thickness didn't matter if you shot at the thin parts. The radio traffic exploded with excited chatter. Other positions reporting successful engagements. Panthers destroyed at long range. A Panther knocked out at nearly 2,000 yards. German armor pulling back across multiple sectors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Moss came over the net. All white elements, consolidate positions, and prepare for counterattack. They'll be back, and they'll be smarter about it, but outstanding work, outstanding. Griffin slumped back in the turret, suddenly exhausted. Novak was grinning like a madman. Walsh kept saying, "We killed a King Tiger," over and over. Even Henderson, usually stoic, had a huge smile, but Griffin's mind was already moving to the next problem. They'd won this engagement because the Germans hadn't expected effective resistance. The next time, they'd be more careful. They'd advance with better reconnaissance. They'd use infantry to flush out American positions before committing armor. The tactical advantage of surprise was gone. Over the next 3 days, the battle developed into a grinding defensive action. German forces continued to push towards St. Vith from multiple directions. American units, outnumbered and outgunned, traded space for time, falling back from position to position, making the Germans pay for every mile. The M-36s of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion were constantly in motion. Shoot, displace, relocate, find a flanking angle, take the shot, get out before return fire arrived. Never engage frontally. Always seek the side or rear armor. Make the Germans turn to face you, then hit them from a different angle. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but it was effective. On December 18th, Griffin's crew destroyed a Panther at 1,400 yards with a single shot through the side turret armor. On the 19th, they knocked out a Jagged Panther tank destroyer from ambush, the 90mm round penetrating the superstructure and detonating the ammunition. On the 20th, they engaged two Panzer P4s, destroying both in less than a minute. Other crews reported similar successes. The 702nd destroyed 23 German armored vehicles in 5 days. The 703rd, the same battalion that had conducted the testing, declaring the 90mm inadequate, destroyed 18. The 740th, also equipped with M36s, claimed 14 kills, including 3 more King Tigers. The German advance slowed, then stalled, then stopped altogether at St. Vith. American resistance, combined with deteriorating weather and supply problems, forced the Germans to bypass the town rather than take it directly. The planned breakthrough to the Meuse River never happened. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January 1945, but the critical phase, the race to stop the German breakthrough, ended in the 3rd week of December. M36 tank destroyers played a crucial role in that success. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The weapon officially declared inadequate against German heavy armor had proven devastatingly effective when used correctly. The gun that failed testing had killed dozens of Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers in actual combat. What had changed? Not the gun, not the ammunition. What changed was understanding. The testing conducted by the 703rd Battalion in early December had been methodologically sound. An M36 firing standard, M82 armor-piercing rounds could not penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at any combat range. That was accurate. The testing report said so explicitly, and battlefield experience confirmed it. But the testing had evaluated the gun against a static target, head-on, under ideal conditions. It measured maximum penetration against maximum armor thickness. It answered the question, can this gun defeat this armor frontally? Combat asked a different question. Can this gun kill this tank? The answer turned out to be yes, if you didn't fight on the tank's terms. The King Tiger was designed around a tactical philosophy that had served Germany well. Present your strongest armor to the enemy. Use superior firepower to dominate the engagement. Rely on armor thickness to defeat incoming fire. It worked brilliantly when fighting Soviet tanks that had to approach across open ground, when engaging British armor in defensive positions, when the Germans controlled the engagement parameters. It worked less well against American tank destroyer doctrine that emphasized mobility, flexibility, and refusing to fight fair. American crews learned quickly. Don't fight King Tigers head on. Don't sit still and trade shots. Move constantly. Use terrain. Find angles where the armor is thinner. The turret ring, the engine deck, the side hull, the rear plate. Every tank had vulnerable spots. The trick was getting a shot at those spots before the enemy could return fire. The M36 was perfect for this kind of warfare. It had good gun depression, allowing it to fire from hull-down positions. The electric turret traverse was fast enough to track moving targets. The chassis, based on the Sherman, was reliable and easy to maintain. And the 90mm gun, while inadequate against frontal armor, was absolutely devastating against side armor at any range where you could hit the target. By late December, German tank commanders had learned to fear the M36. Intelligence reports captured after the battle showed that German units specifically warned about American tank destroyers with powerful guns that attacked from unexpected angles. Tactical guidance emphasized maintaining all-round security and avoiding linear formations where side armor could be exposed. The King Tiger remained a formidable weapon, but it was no longer invincible. The myth of German armor superiority, already cracking, shattered completely during the Ardennes offensive. The testing report from early December was never officially corrected. It remained on file, accurately documenting that the M36's 90mm gun could not penetrate Tiger II frontal armor with standard ammunition. The report wasn't wrong. It just wasn't relevant. Because combat isn't a test range. Tanks don't sit motionless, presenting their thickest armor. Doctrine matters, tactics matter. And a weapon's effectiveness depends as much on how it's used as on its theoretical capabilities. Frank Griffin survived the Battle of the Bulge. His M36 was knocked out on January 8, 1945, by a Panzerfaust wielded by German infantry during street fighting near Höfelitz. The crew bailed out without casualties and was reassigned to a replacement vehicle within 24 hours. Griffin continued fighting with the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion until the German surrender in May 1945. His personal tally included 2 King Tigers, 4 Panthers, 3 Panzerpfeifers, and 1 Jagd Panther. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on December 17th when he destroyed the first King Tiger. The citation mentioned his exemplary courage and tactical skill in engaging superior enemy armor. It did not mention that he was using a weapon officially rated as inadequate for the task. After the war, Griffin rarely talked about his combat experiences. When he did, he had a standard answer for people who asked about fighting German heavy tanks. The Germans built the best tanks of the war, thick armor, powerful guns, well designed, but they forgot that the best tank isn't the one that can take the most hits. It's the one that doesn't get hit in the first place. The M36 Jackson continued in service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea, where it easily destroyed North Korean T-34-85s. It served with Allied armies around the world throughout the 1950s and 60s. Yugoslavia used M36s during the Balkan conflicts in the 1990s, more than 50 years after the vehicle's initial design. The 90mm gun that failed testing in December 1944 went on to arm the M26 Pershing, America's first successful heavy tank. The same gun, with minor modifications, armed the M46 and M47 Patton tanks. Variants of the 90mm remained in American service until the early 1960s. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Bulge shaped American armor doctrine for decades. The emphasis on mobility over armor protection, on firepower over survivability, on tactical flexibility over rigid engagement parameters, all became hallmarks of American armored warfare through the Cold War and beyond. But perhaps the most enduring lesson wasn't about tanks or guns or tactics. It was about the danger of accepting limitations at face value. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate was accurate within its parameters, but combat operates outside parameters. Real battles don't follow test protocols. The German engineers who designed the King Tiger assumed enemies would engage frontally because that's how tank combat had always worked. They built their tank to win that kind of fight. American crews simply refused to fight that way. They asked different questions, pursued different solutions, and won battles with weapons that shouldn't have worked. This pattern repeated throughout the war. British forces used inadequate 2-pounder guns to destroy Italian tanks in North Africa by targeting vision ports and track assemblies. Soviet crews in T-34s defeated Tigers by overwhelming them through sheer numbers and accepting catastrophic losses. American bomber crews survived unsurvivable damage through modifications never considered by designers. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate remains a fascinating document. It's accurate in every technical detail. The penetration figures are correct. The metallurgical analysis is sound. The conclusions follow logically from the methodology. What the report couldn't measure was human ingenuity, the ability of crews under pressure to find solutions to impossible problems, the willingness to ignore official conclusions and trust battlefield experience, the tactical creativity that turned a weapon's weakness into strength by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The story of the M36 Jackson during the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about the limits of testing and the importance of adaptability. It's about soldiers who looked at a problem, rejected the official answer, and found their own solution. It's about the difference between what weapons can do in theory and what they accomplish in the hands of people determined to succeed. December 14, 1944, testing said the M36 couldn't kill King Tigers. December 17th, crews did it anyway. The difference between those 3 days was understanding that adequate depends entirely on context, that limitations are often just failure of imagination, and that the purpose of a weapon isn't to pass tests, it's to win battles. The M36 Jackson won battles. It did so with a gun everyone said wouldn't work, against tanks everyone said were invincible by crews who decided official testing was less important than finding a way to get the job done. In the end, that's what separated the inadequate from the legendary. Not the weapon itself, but the refusal to accept what couldn't be done. The story of the M36 Jackson during the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about the limits of testing and the importance of adaptability. It's about soldiers who looked at a problem, rejected the official answer, and found their own solution. It's about the difference between what weapons can do in theory and what they accomplish in the hands of people determined to succeed. December 14th, 1944, testing said the M36 couldn't kill King Tigers. December 17th, crews did it anyway. The difference between those 3 days was understanding that adequate depends entirely on context, that limitations are often just failure of imagination, and that the purpose of a weapon isn't to pass tests, it's to win battles. The M36 Jackson won battles. It did so with a gun everyone said wouldn't work, against tanks everyone said were invincible by crews who decided official testing was less important than finding a way to get the job done. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate wasn't just a technical document, it was a psychological weapon the Germans never knew they'd deployed. When American crews received word that their gun couldn't penetrate King Tiger armor, morale plummeted. Some requested transfers, others wrote home describing impossible odds. But the crews at St. Vith never gave the Germans that satisfaction. They took the testing report, acknowledged its accuracy, and proceeded to ignore its implications. They didn't deny the King Tiger's frontal armor was impenetrable. They simply decided not to shoot at the frontal armor. This mindset became characteristic of American military innovation. Accept the limitation, refuse to be limited by it. It appeared again in Korea, when outgunned forces used mobility to counter superior numbers. It continues today in asymmetric warfare, where technological disadvantages are overcome through tactical creativity. The testing engineers weren't wrong. They were correct within their framework, but frameworks like armor can be circumvented. The real failure wasn't the gun's penetration capability. It was assuming penetration capability was the only measure that mattered. When Griffin positioned his M36 to engage the rear tank in the German column, he wasn't defying physics. He was defying the assumption that battle had to be fought on German terms. The King Tiger's designers created a tank optimized for frontal engagements. Griffin simply declined to provide one. The M36 Jackson destroyed more than 300 German armored vehicles during the final 6 months of World War II. It did this not by being better than testing said it was, but by being used differently than testing assumed it would be. That distinction between inherent capability and effective application is the true legacy. The gun that failed testing succeeded in combat because the men using it understood that success isn't about meeting specifications. It's about achieving objectives, regardless of what specifications say is possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. January 16th, 1945. The sky over Suchin airfield in southern China hung heavy with smoke and the distant rumble of artillery. Major Yasuhiko Kuroi stood beside the grounded American fighter, his hands resting on its sleek metal skin, still warm from the emergency landing. The paint shimmered in the afternoon light, unmarked except for the bullet holes that had forced it down. On the fuselage, painted in careful script, was a name: Evelina. The pilot, a young American lieutenant named Sam McMillan, had already been taken away by guards. His hands were bound, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. He expected torture, imprisonment, perhaps execution under the Enemy Airmen's Act that had condemned so many Allied flyers to death. What he could not have known was that his aircraft, this silver machine that bore his squadron mate's girlfriend's name, would soon reveal a truth more devastating to the Japanese than any bomb. Kuroi circled the P-51 Mustang slowly, studying every line, every panel, every rivet. He was a 30-victory ace, a combat veteran who had flown against the Americans since Malaya, through Burma, across the skies of China. He had faced lightnings and thunderbolts, warhawks and wildcats, but the Mustang was different. It had appeared over the front lines like a ghost, faster than anything Japan could field, able to escort bombers deeper into the heart of Japanese-controlled territory than anyone had thought possible. Now, standing before one intact, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but a creeping unease that whispered a question he did not want to ask. What if everything he had been told about American inferiority was a lie? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The orders came swiftly. Paint over the American stars with Hinomaru roundels, prepare the aircraft for flight, deliver it to the Army Air Inspection Center at Fusa, near Tokyo. Kuroi would be the one to fly it. As ground crews worked to repair minor damage and apply Japanese markings, he watched in silence. The Mustang's lines were unlike anything in the Japanese arsenal. Where the Ki-84 and Ki-61 had angular, aggressive profiles, this aircraft seemed to flow. Every surface, designed not just for function, but for efficiency. The belly scoop that cooled the Merlin engine sat flush against the fuselage, creating almost no drag. No oil streaked from the cowling, no fuel stained the wings. One of the mechanics, a veteran named Sergeant Watanabe, ran his hand along the wing and murmured, "It doesn't leak." The other men stopped and stared. Every Japanese aircraft leaked. Oil from the engine, hydraulic fluid from the landing gear, fuel from poorly sealed tanks. It was simply accepted as the cost of flight. But this machine, built in a factory in Texas, assembled by workers Kuroi would never meet, did not leak a single drop. That night, before the flight to Japan, Kuroe sat alone in the operations hut, studying intelligence reports on the P-51. Range: over 1,000 miles with drop tanks. Speed: 440 miles per hour at altitude. Armament: 650 caliber machine guns with over 1,600 rounds. Pilot armor: thick steel plate, protecting the seat and head. Radio equipment: direction finding capability, multiple frequencies, crystal clear transmission. He compared the numbers to Japan's finest, the Ki-84 Hayate. Similar speed, similar armament, but the Mustang could fly twice as far, and its equipment was a generation ahead. The report concluded with a single line that felt like a blade pressed against his throat. If the Americans capture Iwo Jima, these aircraft will be able to reach the homeland. Kuroe closed the folder and stared out the window at the Mustang, now wearing the rising sun on its wings. In 3 days, he would fly it. In 3 days, he would know the truth, and he suspected, with the certainty of a man who had survived too many battles to believe in comforting lies, that the truth would be worse than any propaganda had prepared him for. The morning of January 19th dawned cold and clear. Kuroe climbed into the Mustang's cockpit, settling into the seat with a cautious reverence. The space was larger than any Japanese fighter he had flown. His knees did not press against the instrument panel. His shoulders had room to move. The seat itself was padded, adjustable, designed for comfort on long missions. Behind his head, thick armor plate curved protectively around the pilot's position. He tapped it with his knuckle. Solid, heavy. American pilots flew into battle wrapped in steel. The instrument panel gleamed with clarity. Every gauge was labeled in English, but the layout was intuitive. Altimeter, airspeed, fuel, oil pressure, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature. A direction-finding radio sat to his right, its dial marked with compass headings. He toggled the radio switch and heard the crackle of static, clear and strong. Japanese radios, when they worked at all, hissed and sputtered with interference. This one sounded like a voice speaking directly into his ear. He primed the engine, set the mixture, and engaged the starter. The Packard-built Merlin coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, powerful growl that vibrated through the entire airframe. No misfires, no hesitation. He advanced the throttle slightly and felt the aircraft surge forward with eager responsiveness. The tail came up easily as he taxied, the visibility over the nose far better than the long-nosed Ki-61 he had trained new pilots on. At the end of the runway, he ran through the checks one final time. Flaps down, trim set, mixture rich. He released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was immediate and relentless. The Mustang leaped down the runway, eating distance with a hunger that shocked him. At 90 miles per hour, he pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted into the air as if it had been waiting all along to return to the sky. The climb rate was extraordinary. Kuroe banked east toward Japan, watching the airspeed settle at 280 miles per hour in cruise. He was barely using half throttle. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft surge ahead, the airspeed needle climbing past 350, then 400. The Mustang wasn't flying. It was cutting through the air like a sword through silk. He tested a turn, rolling into a gentle bank. The controls were light, responsive, perfectly balanced. He tightened the turn, pulling harder, and the Mustang responded without hesitation, carving through the sky with a grace that bordered on supernatural. This was not the brutal, muscular agility of a Zero or the heavy, determined strength of a Thunderbolt. This was precision, engineering, art. Hours passed. The fuel gauge barely moved. He flew over the East China Sea, the waters below glittering in the afternoon sun, and allowed himself a moment of terrible clarity. This was what Japan was fighting. Not just an enemy with more pilots or more factories, an enemy with better machines, better equipment, better everything. By the time the coast of Japan appeared on the horizon, Kuroe had stopped trying to find faults in the Mustang. There were none that mattered. It was faster than anything Japan could field. It could fly farther. It was better armed, better protected, better equipped. And if the Americans could build these by the thousands, as intelligence suggested they could, then the war was already over. Japan just didn't know it yet. He landed at Fusa as the sun dipped below the mountains, the Mustang touching down with the gentle precision of a bird returning to its nest. As the engines spun down and silence returned, Kuroe sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands still gripping the controls. Ground crews rushed forward, officers shouted questions, but he heard none of it. He was thinking of the young American pilot, Sam McMillan, now imprisoned somewhere in the north. That man had expected torture. Instead, his aircraft was about to torture every Japanese pilot who flew against it by revealing a truth they could no longer deny. 3 days after landing at Suchin, Kuroe climbed out of the Mustang at Fusa and wrote his first evaluation report. His handwriting was careful, measured, as though the words themselves carried weight. I was astonished with its performance. Turn characteristics were splendid, almost the same as the Ki-84 in a horizontal turn. The radio transmitter was excellent. The armament and other miscellaneous equipment was very good, particularly when compared with their Japanese equivalents. And moreover, it had a radio direction finder. He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added the line that would define everything that followed. I had such confidence with this P-51 that I feared no Japanese fighters. The headquarters at Fusa fell silent when they read those words. An ace with 30 victories, a man who had fought the Allies across half of Asia, was saying that he would rather fly the enemy's aircraft than his own. The implications were catastrophic. If one Mustang, flown by a Japanese pilot, could dominate Japan's finest fighters, what would happen when hundreds of them appeared over Tokyo? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. On April 7, 1945, just weeks after Kuro's evaluation, 96 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-29 Superfortresses over the Japanese homeland for the first time. They had launched from Iwo Jima, the volcanic island that American Marines had taken at terrible cost. The distance was 750 miles, impossible for any fighter Japan possessed, but not for the Mustang. Kuroe watched from the ground as the formations passed overhead, silver specks glinting in the high-altitude sun. Somewhere up there, Japanese pilots were discovering what he already knew. The Americans had come to stay. The testing at Fusa continued for weeks. Evelina was flown in mock combat against the Ki-43 Oscar, the Ki-61 Tony, the Ki-84 Frank. Every Japanese pilot who faced the Mustang came away shaken. The Oscar, nimble and lightweight, could not match its speed. The Tony, sleek and modern, could not match its range. The Frank, Japan's finest fighter, could barely keep pace in a dive and was hopelessly outmatched in equipment. One pilot, a young lieutenant named Nakamura, landed after a mock engagement and climbed out of his Ki-100 trembling. "It toyed with us," he said quietly. "We had altitude, we had position, and it still got behind us." His squadron commander, Captain Masashi Sumita, nodded grimly. He had flown against Kuro in the Mustang twice. Both times, the engagement had ended the same way. The Mustang climbed, dove, and maneuvered with such effortless superiority that resistance felt futile. Sumita later recalled, "Major Kuro taught us how to take our aircraft out of the P-51's axis when being chased, but his lessons began with a warning. If the opponent is a P-51 and you are not in a perfect position, do not engage, survive, and escape. That is the only tactic that works." The ground crews at Fusa were equally stunned. They disassembled sections of the Mustang, examining the construction with the meticulous care of surgeons. The engine mounts were precisely machined. The control cables were steel-braided and perfectly tensioned. The fuel system was self-sealing. The tanks lined with rubber that would close around bullet holes and prevent fire. Every valve, every bolt, every panel was manufactured to tolerances Japanese factories could only dream of achieving. Sergeant Watanabe, who had first noticed the lack of oil leaks, spent 3 days studying the engine cowling. "There is no wasted space," he reported to his superior. "Every component fits together like a puzzle. and nothing, not one single part, leaks. His superior, a colonel who had overseen aircraft production for 20 years, could only shake his head. "We have been building fighters with string and prayers," he muttered. "They have been building them with mathematics." But it was the equipment inside the cockpit that truly revealed the gap. The radio direction finder allowed the pilot to navigate by tuning into ground stations and following the signal. The gun sight was gyroscopic, automatically calculating lead for deflection shots. The oxygen system was regulated and reliable, allowing pilots to fight at altitudes where Japanese pilots gasped for breath. Even small details, like the quality of the plexiglass canopy, which did not distort or yellow over time, spoke to a level of industrial sophistication that Japan could not match. In late March, a captured American document was translated and circulated among senior staff. It was a training manual for P-51 pilots, and it included a maintenance schedule: oil changes every 25 hours, engine overhaul every 200 hours, expected service life of the airframe, 1,000 hours. Japanese fighters were considered worn out at 300 hours. Their engines needed constant maintenance, and even then, failure was common. The Americans were building machines designed to last. By mid-April of 1945, Major Kuro received new orders that would transform his role from test pilot to prophet of doom. He was to lead what the Army Air Force called a flying circus, a traveling demonstration unit composed of captured Allied aircraft. Evelina would be the centerpiece. His mission: tour every major fighter unit in Japan and teach pilots how to survive encounters with the Mustang. It was an admission of defeat disguised as tactical training. The first stop was a Kano flying school, the elite training ground where Japan's best instructors prepared new pilots for combat. Kuroi landed Evelina on the grass strip as hundreds of cadets and instructors gathered to watch. The Mustang's silver fuselage gleamed under the spring sun, the red Hinomaru circles painted over the American stars looking almost obscene against the aircraft's obvious foreign elegance. Among those watching was instructor Yohei Hinoki, a legendary ace known as the iron-legged pilot. He had lost part of his leg in combat, but continued flying through sheer determination. More importantly, he was the first Japanese pilot to shoot down a Mustang. Back in November of 1943, over Burma, he approached Kuroi with the careful respect one warrior shows another. "Major General Imagawa asked me to master the P-51 and then demonstrate it to other pilots," Hinoki said. "I didn't have great confidence in my ability to fly such an advanced aircraft with my disabled leg, but I made up my mind to do my best." Kuroi led him to the aircraft. Hinoki circled it slowly, his practiced eye taking in every detail. "I could see the superiority of its equipment," he later wrote in his diary. "The shiny fuselage with the open red mouth of a dragon painted on the nose. I saw several red dots on the side of the cockpit, probably recording Japanese aircraft the pilot had shot down." He paused at those marks, each one representing a Japanese pilot who had died. With the radiator under the fuselage, it looked very sleek and deadly. It reminded me of the day I had first seen the P-51 in the sky above Burma. When Hinoki climbed into the cockpit, his artificial leg making the process awkward, he was immediately struck by the design. "The seat was roomy," he recorded. "I did not have any trouble with my artificial leg on the rudder pedal. Everything was positioned perfectly for comfort and efficiency." Kuro briefed him on the controls, pointing out the various switches and gauges, all labeled in English but arranged with such logical clarity that the language barrier barely mattered. "Major Kuro told me how easy the P-51 was to fly," Hinoki wrote. "At first I thought he was being kind, but when I took off, I understood. The aircraft practically flew itself." Over the following weeks, Kuroi conducted demonstration after demonstration at each airfield. The routine was the same. Japanese pilots would take off in their best fighters, Ki-100s, Ki-84s, even the imported Focke-Wulf 190 that Germany had sent as a symbol of Axis cooperation. Kuroi would wait until they were airborne, then climb into Evelina and follow. The engagements were not close. At one base, near Osaka, Captain Masatsugu Sumita and Lieutenant Nakamura took off in two Ki-100 fighters, widely considered Japan's best hope against the Mustang. The Ki-100 was sleek, fast, and maneuverable, with excellent visibility and reasonable armament. On paper, it could compete. In practice, the gap was devastating. Sumita and Nakamura started with altitude advantage, circling at 15,000 feet, while Kuroi climbed from below. They positioned themselves perfectly, the sun at their backs, ready to dive on the Mustang the moment it came into range. It should have been a textbook intercept, but Kuroi, flying with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what his machine could do, simply pushed the throttle forward and climbed straight through their altitude. The Mustang's Merlin engine, supercharged and perfectly tuned, pulled the aircraft upward with relentless power. By the time Sumita and Nakamura realized what was happening, Evelina was already above them. They dove after the Mustang, trying to use gravity to close the distance. Kuroi let them come, watching his mirrors as the two Ki-100s plunged toward him. Then, at the last possible moment, he pushed the stick forward and dove as well. The Mustang accelerated past 450 miles per hour, the airframe rock-steady even as the speed built. The Ki-100s, their lighter construction beginning to shudder, could not keep pace. Kuro pulled out of the dive in a smooth climbing loop, bleeding speed with precision, and when he leveled out, he was behind both Japanese fighters. The engagement was over. In a real battle, Sumita and Nakamura would have been dead. After landing, Sumita approached Kuroi with visible frustration. "We had every advantage," he said. "Position, altitude, numbers. How did you reverse it so easily?" Kuroi's answer was simple and devastating. "You need to remember your opponent's speed and climbing ability well. If it had been a plane of the same level, you might have won. But if the opponent was a P-51, that is what happens. Be careful." The message was clear. Against a Mustang, even perfect tactics were not enough. The machine itself was superior, and no amount of skill or courage could fully compensate. These demonstrations had a profound psychological effect on Japanese pilots. Many had believed the propaganda that portrayed American equipment as inferior, mass-produced junk built by soft, undisciplined workers. The Mustang shattered that illusion with brutal efficiency. Here was an aircraft built in the same factories that produced thousands of bombers, fighters, and transports, yet it was more refined, more capable, and more reliable than anything Japan's handcrafted, artisan-built fighters could achieve. The irony was not lost on the pilots. Japan had spent decades cultivating a warrior culture that emphasized spirit over material, fighting prowess over industrial capacity. The samurai tradition taught that superior will could overcome superior weapons. But the Mustang did not care about fighting spirit. It flew faster, climbed higher, and carried more fuel, regardless of the pilot's determination. One young pilot at Akeno, barely 20 years old, approached Kuroi after watching a demonstration. "Sir," he asked quietly, "if the Americans have hundreds of these, how can we win?" Kuroi looked at the young man for a long moment before answering. "We cannot," he said finally, "but we can make them pay for every mile they take. That is all that remains." The flying circus continued through April and into May. At each stop, Kuro delivered the same lessons. Do not dogfight with a Mustang. Do not try to outrun it in level flight. If you are chased, use terrain and clouds. Dive toward the ground, where the Mustang's speed becomes a disadvantage. Brake hard and often to spoil the gunshot. Survive and escape. Those were the only tactics that worked. But beneath the tactical instruction was a deeper, unspoken message. The war was lost. The Americans possessed not just numerical superiority, but technological dominance. Every pilot who flew against Evelina understood this, even if they could not say it aloud. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late May, Evelina began showing signs of wear. The generator, stressed by months of continuous operation without proper replacement parts, started to fail. During a routine flight from Taisho Airfield, the electrical system failed completely, forcing Kuro to make an emergency landing. He brought the Mustang down safely, but the damage was done. Without a replacement generator, and with no way to manufacture one that would meet American specifications, Evelina was grounded. Kuro stood beside the silent aircraft, running his hand along its wing one last time. In 4 months, this single machine had taught Japan more about the war's true state than 1,000 intelligence reports. It had revealed not just American technological superiority, but the vast industrial gap that made that superiority inevitable. The Mustang was not an exception. It was the standard, and America could build them by the thousands. The plan had been to transfer Evelina to a Kino flying school for permanent use as a training aid. But with Japan's infrastructure collapsing under relentless bombing, the transfer never happened. The Mustang sat at Taisho Airfield through June and July, slowly deteriorating. Parts were stripped for study. The engine was disassembled and examined one final time. And then, as American forces closed in and the war entered its final weeks, Evelina simply disappeared. Some records suggest it was buried in a field to prevent capture. Others claim it was bulldozed into a lake. A few veterans remember seeing it pushed into a ravine and covered with earth. Whatever the truth, the physical aircraft vanished, erased as thoroughly as Japan's belief in its own invincibility. But the lessons remained. For Kuroi, the experience of flying Evelina marked a turning point. He had spent 4 years fighting for the Empire, shooting down Allied aircraft, teaching new pilots the way of the warrior. But the Mustang had taught him a different lesson. Wars were not won by spirit alone. They were won by nations that could build better machines, train more pilots, and sustain logistics across oceans. Japan had none of those advantages. It had only courage, and courage without resources was just a slower path to defeat. In his final report on the Mustang, submitted to Army Air Force headquarters in late May, Kuro wrote with uncharacteristic bluntness, "This aircraft represents a level of engineering and industrial capacity that Japan cannot match. Its superiority is not marginal, it is fundamental. We are fighting an enemy who treats quality as standard and produces it in quantities we cannot imagine. This is the truth we must face." The report was filed and forgotten. By June, headquarters was too busy managing the defense of the homeland to care about one test pilot's observations. But Kuro kept a copy, carefully folded in his flight bag. It was evidence of something he would carry for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he had touched the future and found it belonged to someone else. The American pilot, Sam McMillan, who had been shot down and captured on that January afternoon, survived the war. He was held in a prison camp north of Tokyo, enduring the harsh conditions that all Allied POWs faced in the final months of the conflict. He did not know that his aircraft had become a symbol of American industrial might, that it had been flown by a Japanese ace who came to respect it more than his own fighters. When McMillan was liberated in August of 1945, one of the first questions American intelligence officers asked him was about his aircraft. What had happened to it? Had the Japanese captured it intact? McMillan could only shake his head. "I landed it in one piece," he said. "After that, I don't know." It would be years before the full story emerged. Through declassified Japanese documents, interviews with surviving pilots, and the painstaking work of historians, the tale of Evelina slowly came to light. The silver Mustang with a woman's name painted on its nose had become a ghost story, a legend whispered among veterans on both sides of the Pacific. For the Japanese pilots who flew against it, Evelina was proof that they had been lied to. The Americans were not weak. Their equipment was not inferior. Every piece of propaganda that had sustained them through years of brutal combat was revealed as hollow the moment they sat in that cockpit and felt the power of American engineering beneath their hands. For American pilots, the story was different. It was validation, proof that the long supply lines, the massive industrial mobilization, the thousands of workers in factories across the United States had produced something genuinely superior. The Mustang was not just good enough, it was better, and that margin of superiority had saved lives. But perhaps the most profound impact was on one man, Major Yasuhiko Kuroe, the ace who had expected to find weaknesses and instead discovered excellence, carried the memory of Evelina for the rest of his life. After the war ended, he returned to his family's farm, trying to rebuild a life in a shattered nation. Food was scarce. Work was hard. The future seemed impossibly distant. In 1950, when the Japanese government began establishing the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, Kuroe was among the first pilots recruited. His experience with captured aircraft, his tactical knowledge, and his reputation as an ace made him invaluable. He trained new pilots on American-built aircraft, ironically flying the very machines he had once fought against. By 1953, he was commanding a squadron of F-86 Sabre jets, American fighters that were the descendants of the Mustang's design philosophy, sleek, powerful, technologically advanced. He flew them with the same respect he had shown Evelina, understanding that these machines represented not just military hardware, but a different way of thinking about war. In 1955, Kuroe was sent to Britain for advanced training with the Royal Air Force, one of the first Japanese officers to study abroad since the war. British instructors found him quiet, competent, and unusually humble for an ace. During one conversation, an RAF wing commander asked him what it had been like to fly against the Allies. Kuroe thought for a long moment before answering. "We believed in spirit over steel," he said finally. "We believed that determination could overcome material disadvantages. And then I flew a captured Mustang, and I realized we had been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, not because of cowardice or lack of skill, but because we simply did not have the tools." The British officer nodded slowly. "And now? Now I fly aircraft, built by the same people we once fought," Kuroe said, "and I am grateful for them." By 1960, Major Yasuhiko Kuroe had risen to the rank of Major General in the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. He commanded training wings, developed tactical doctrines for jet combat, and mentored a new generation of Japanese pilots who had never known war. To them, he was a respected elder, a man who spoke rarely but with weight. They knew he had been an ace in the old war, but he never bragged about his victories. Instead, when young pilots asked him what combat had taught him, he would tell them about a silver Mustang named Evelina. "It taught me," he would say, "that the best weapon is not the one that makes you feel superior. It is the one that brings you home alive." The story became legend within the JASDF. New pilots heard about the captured American fighter that had humbled Japan's finest aces. Some thought it was exaggerated, a cautionary tale meant to keep them humble. But the older pilots, the ones who had survived the war, knew it was true. They had seen Evelina, they had flown against it, and they had learned, as Kuroe had learned, that acknowledging an enemy's superiority was not weakness, it was wisdom. In the early 1960s, American and Japanese aviation historians began corresponding, trying to piece together the stories of captured aircraft on both sides. Through these exchanges, Kuroe learned what had happened to Sam McMillan, the pilot who had been forced to land Evelina at Suchin Airfield. McMillan had survived imprisonment, returned to Connecticut, married, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about his time as a POW, the memories too painful to revisit. But when he learned that a Japanese general had flown his aircraft and come to respect it, McMillan wrote a letter. It was brief, formal, addressed to Major General Yasuhiko Kuroe, Japan Air Self-Defense Force. The letter said, simply, "I heard you flew my Mustang. I'm glad it served a purpose beyond the war. Perhaps it taught both of us something about the machines we trusted our lives to." Kuroe kept that letter in his desk drawer for years. He never responded. What could he say? That flying McMillan's aircraft had shattered his faith in his own nation's propaganda, that it had forced him to confront the reality that Japan had been outmatched not by better warriors, but by better factories. That every victory he had won in the skies over Burma and China felt hollow in retrospect, knowing that the enemy he fought possessed reserves Japan could never hope to match. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his copy of the final Evelina evaluation report, two pieces of paper, one from an American who had expected torture and received survival, one from a Japanese pilot who had expected superiority and discovered humility. On December 5, 1965, Major General Kuroi went fishing in a river near his home. It was a cold morning, the water running fast with winter melt. He was 47 years old, still active in the JASDF, still respected as one of Japan's finest pilots. His colleagues described him as a man who had found balance in life, someone who had reconciled his wartime service with his post-war duty. But sometime that afternoon, Kuro drowned. The exact circumstances were never fully explained. Some said he slipped on wet rocks and was swept away by the current. Others whispered that he had simply waded too deep, lost in thought, and never fought against the water's pull. His body was recovered hours later, downstream from where he had been fishing. At his funeral, pilots from across Japan gathered to pay respects. American officers stationed at Japanese bases attended as well, a gesture of the alliance that had replaced enmity. One American colonel, a Mustang pilot during the war who had flown missions over Japan in 1945, stood quietly at the back of the ceremony. When asked later why he had come, he said simply, "He understood what we built. That deserves respect." Among Kuro's personal effects, his family found the two letters and a small notebook. The notebook contained sketches of aircraft he had flown throughout his career: Ki-44s, Ki-84s, Focke-Wulf 190s, F-86 Sabres. But the most detailed drawing, rendered with careful precision over multiple pages, was of a P-51 Mustang. Beneath it, in Japanese characters, he had written, "The aircraft that told the truth." The story of Evelina did not end with Kuro's death. Through the 1970s and 80s, historians continued searching for the aircraft's remains. Expeditions were mounted to survey lakes near Taisho Airfield. Fields were excavated, veterans were interviewed, but no trace of the Mustang was ever found. It had vanished as completely as the war itself, leaving only memories and reports. In 2000, aviation historian Henry Sakida published his research in Flight Journal magazine, finally identifying Sam McMillan as the pilot who had landed Evelina at Suchin. By then, McMillan was elderly and in poor health, unable to provide detailed interviews, but his family confirmed the story. Yes, he had been shot down. Yes, he had survived imprisonment. And yes, he had always wondered what became of his squadron mate's aircraft. Oliver Strawbridge, the pilot whose girlfriend's name adorned the Mustang, had lived until 1987. He never married Evelina. Instead, he married a woman named Ruth Ann and built a quiet life far from aviation. When asked about the aircraft years later, he would only say, "It was a good plane. I'm glad it came home, even if I didn't fly it." For the Japanese pilots who had flown against Evelina during those demonstrations in 1945, the memories remained sharp decades later. Masatsugu Sumita, the Ki-100 pilot who had been outmaneuvered so thoroughly, recalled in a 1998 interview, "Major Kuroi saved lives by showing us the truth. We learned to respect our enemy's machines, and that respect taught us caution. Caution kept some of us alive." Yohei Hinoki, the iron-legged ace who had flown Evelina despite his disability, wrote in his memoirs, "Sitting in that cockpit, I understood for the first time that we were not fighting equals. We were fighting an industrial colossus with the spirit of warriors. Spirit alone is not enough when your opponent has both spirit and superior tools." The legacy of one captured aircraft rippled across generations. In modern Japan, Air Self-Defense Force training, instructors still reference Evelina when teaching young pilots about respecting enemy capabilities. The story has been simplified over time, reduced to its essential lesson: never underestimate your opponent's technology. Never let pride blind you to reality. These principles, learned at such terrible cost during the war, became foundational to Japan's post-war military philosophy. In the United States, the story took on different meaning. For American aviation enthusiasts and historians, Evelina represented the validation of American engineering prowess. Here was proof that the billions spent on aircraft development, the millions of hours in factories, the countless design iterations had produced something genuinely world-class. The Mustang was not just adequate, it was exceptional. And that excellence had been recognized even by the enemy. But there was also a quieter, more profound lesson embedded in the tale. Sam McMillan had expected torture. Instead, his aircraft became a teacher. Yasuhiko Kuroe had expected to find weaknesses to exploit. Instead, he found excellence to acknowledge. Both men had their expectations shattered, and both, in different ways, were changed by the experience. The war had been full of hatred, brutality, and propaganda on both sides. Japanese soldiers had committed atrocities. American bombers had incinerated cities. Both nations had dehumanized the other, creating narratives that justified increasingly horrific violence. But in the story of One Silver Mustang, there was a moment of unexpected truth, a moment when a Japanese pilot sat in an American cockpit and thought, "This is better than what we have," and had the courage to say so. That honesty, delivered in official reports and tactical briefings, may have saved lives. Pilots who learned from Kuro's demonstrations understood that survival meant avoiding engagement when possible, using hit-and-run tactics, and never underestimating the Mustang's capabilities. Some of those pilots survived the war because of that knowledge. In the decades since, aviation archaeologists have continued searching for Evelina's remains. Modern ground-penetrating radar has surveyed the areas around Taisho Airfield. Lakes have been drained and explored. But the Mustang remains lost, buried somewhere in Japan's earth or submerged in its waters, a ghost that refuses to be found. Perhaps that is fitting. Evelina was never about the physical aircraft. It was about what that aircraft represented, the collision between propaganda and reality, the moment when belief met evidence and shattered, the slow, painful acknowledgement that courage and skill were not enough when the enemy possessed superior tools and the industrial capacity to mass-produce them. For viewers watching this story unfold across decades and continents, the question remains, what do we do when our beliefs are proven wrong? When the narrative we have been taught, the worldview we have built our identity upon, crumbles in the face of undeniable evidence? Kuro's answer was to adapt, to learn, to carry the truth forward, even when it was uncomfortable. He spent the rest of his life flying aircraft built by the nation he had once fought, teaching tactics developed by former enemies, and serving in an alliance with the very people who had defeated Japan. That required a flexibility of spirit far greater than anything demanded in combat. Sam McMillan's answer was to survive and move forward. He returned home, built a life, and carried the memory of his capture quietly. He did not seek revenge or hold grudges. He simply lived, which in itself was a victory. And Evelina's answer, if an aircraft could answer, was to teach, to be a bridge between two nations, two philosophies, two ways of thinking about war and technology. The Mustang's message was simple. Excellence speaks for itself. It does not need propaganda or exaggeration. It simply is. As the sun sets on this story, we're left with images that span 75 years. A silver Mustang landing at a Chinese airfield, its pilot terrified of what comes next. A Japanese ace climbing into an enemy cockpit and discovering uncomfortable truths. Young pilots gathering to watch demonstrations that would save some of their lives. An American prisoner surviving in silence. A Japanese general drowning in a river. His thoughts forever unknown. And somewhere, buried beneath Japanese soil or water, the remains of an aircraft that changed minds more effectively than any bomb. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.